On the morning of July 4, 1997, a warm haze settled over Mexico City. Inside the sterile operating room of Santa Monica Hospital, beneath fluorescent lights that hummed with artificial brightness, Amado Carrillo Fuentes lay unconscious on the surgical table. The anesthesia coursed through his veins. The scalpels gleamed. The plastic surgeons marked his face with purple ink, preparing to reshape the features that had made him one of the most wanted men in the Western Hemisphere. 8 hours later, his heart would stop. The Lord of the Skies would fall to earth. But in the exclusive neighborhood of Jardines del Pedregal, behind walls reinforced with bulletproof glass and steel, his mansion waited, silent, opulent, and filled with secrets that would take decades to uncover. This is the story of a $4.5 million palace built on powder and paranoia. This is the story of how a farmer's son from Sinaloa commanded an empire worth $25 billion, how he moved mountains of cocaine across continents using the sky itself as his highway, and how his fortress in one of Mexico City's most prestigious neighborhoods became the nerve center of an operation so vast it reshaped the global drug trade. This is the story of ambition without limit, wealth without peace, and a mansion that stands today as a monument to the empire of the man they called El Señor de los Cielos. But before the fleet of Boeing 727s, before the mansions and the millions, before the plastic surgery and the conspiracy theories that would follow his death, there was a boy born into poverty in the mountains of Sinaloa. Amado Carrillo Fuentes entered the world on December 17, 1956, in the small agricultural community of Guamuchilito, nestled in the rugged terrain of northwestern Mexico. His father worked the land. His mother raised 11 children in conditions that most would describe as hardship, though to them it was simply life. The Carrillo family knew hunger. They knew the ache of uncertain harvests and the weight of generations spent working soil that belonged to someone else. The mountains of Sinaloa had produced farmers for centuries, men who rose with the sun, broke their backs in the fields, and died without ever seeing beyond the horizons that hemmed them in from birth. But Sinaloa had begun producing something else by the time Amado reached adolescence. In the hidden valleys and remote plateaus, a different kind of crop was taking root. Opium poppies swayed in fields where corn once grew. Marijuana plants stretched toward the sun in clearings protected by men with rifles and radios. The drug trade was not new to Mexico, but in the 1970s it was transforming, expanding, becoming organized in ways that would reshape the nation's destiny. Young men from villages like Guamuchilito faced a choice that their fathers never had: continue the generational cycle of poverty, or step into the shadows of an industry that promised wealth beyond imagination and violence beyond mercy. Amado Carrillo made his choice early. His uncle, Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, had already established himself in the drug trade, earning the nickname Don Nito and building connections that reached from Sinaloa to Guadalajara. Through Don Nito, young Amado entered a world where money moved faster than the law, where power was measured not in acres or cattle, but in kilograms and roots, in plazas controlled and politicians purchased. He learned the fundamental mathematics of the trade: buy low in the production zones, sell high in the consumption markets, and eliminate anyone who threatened the equation. But Amado possessed something that set him apart from the countless other young men drawn into the drug trade during those years. He possessed vision. While others thought in terms of shipments and street corners, Amado thought in terms of systems and logistics. While others settled for controlling a neighborhood or a town, Amado studied the entire supply chain, identifying bottlenecks and inefficiencies, calculating solutions with the mind of a businessman, analyzing a legitimate corporation. He saw what others missed. The drug trade's greatest limitation was not production or demand, but transportation. The cocaine came from Colombia, produced in laboratories hidden in the jungles and mountains, refined from coca leaves into white powder worth more than gold by weight. The demand came from the United States, where millions of users created an insatiable market that consumed tons of product every year, generating billions of dollars in revenue. But between Colombia and the United States lay thousands of miles of ocean, jungle, desert, and the most heavily patrolled border in the world. The transportation problem was the industry's choke point, and whoever solved it would become not just wealthy, but powerful beyond measure. In the 1980s, most cocaine destined for the United States traveled by boat or was carried in small planes that island-hopped through the Caribbean, landing on remote airstrips in Florida and Louisiana. The Colombians controlled this route, paying Mexican traffickers modest fees to move product across the U.S.-Mexico border in cars, trucks, and on the backs of desperate migrants. The Mexicans were subcontractors, paid per shipment, never allowed to touch the real money that flowed from American streets back to Colombian cartels. Amado Carrillo watched this arrangement and recognized it for what it was, an opportunity disguised as an insult. The Mexicans were doing the most dangerous work, crossing the border, facing American law enforcement, risking decades in prison, for the smallest share of the profits. The Colombians kept the lion's share because they controlled the product and the primary transportation. But what if the Mexicans could control transportation? What if they could move cocaine in quantities that made the Caribbean route obsolete? What if they could become not subcontractors, but partners, demanding payment not in cash per shipment, but in cocaine itself, which they could then sell independently for multiples of what the Colombians were paying them? This was the vision that crystallized in Amado Carrillo's mind as he rose through the ranks of the Guadalajara cartel in the 1980s, working under Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, the godfather who had united Mexico's fractured drug traffickers into a single powerful organization. Amado managed operations in Ojinaga, a border town across from Presidio, Texas, learning the intricacies of cross-border smuggling, building relationships with American distributors, and accumulating the capital and connections that would allow him to eventually break free and pursue his grand design. But vision alone does not build empires. Vision requires ruthlessness, the willingness to wade through blood to reach the golden shore. In 1993, Amado worked as second-in-command to Rafael Aguilar Guajardo, who controlled the Juarez Plaza, the stretch of border centered on Ciudad Juarez, across from El Paso, Texas. The Juarez Plaza was valuable real estate in the drug trade, a corridor through which millions of dollars of narcotics flowed northward and millions of dollars in cash flowed south. Rafael Aguilar Guajardo sat atop this golden pipeline, and Amado Carrillo wanted what he had. On April 12, 1993, Rafael Aguilar Guajardo was assassinated in Cancun. The gunman found him relaxing at a resort, far from the violence of the border, perhaps believing that distance provided safety. It did not. The bullets ended his reign in seconds, and before his body was cold, Amado Carrillo Fuentes had claimed leadership of the Juarez cartel. Some whispered that Amado had ordered the assassination. Others suggested it was a rival faction. The truth dissolved into rumor and legend, as truth often does in a world where witnesses rarely testify and investigators rarely investigate too deeply. What mattered was the result. At age 36, Amado controlled one of Mexico's most important drug trafficking organizations, and he immediately began implementing the vision that would transform him into El Señor de los Cielos. He went shopping for airplanes. Not the small Cessnas and Pipers that most traffickers used for short hops across borders, planes that carried a few hundred kilograms at most and required constant refueling. Amado wanted jets. He wanted Boeing 727s, the workhorses of commercial aviation, capable of carrying 6 to 7 tons of cargo across thousands of miles without refueling. He wanted aircraft that could fly from Colombian airstrips directly to landing zones in northern Mexico, bypassing the Caribbean entirely, reducing the risk of interdiction and slashing transportation time from days to hours. Between 1993 and 1997, Amado Carrillo Fuentes purchased at least 22 aircraft from legitimate airlines, either directly or through front companies that disguised the transactions. He paid millions in cash, buying planes that airlines were retiring from passenger service, aircraft with tens of thousands of flight hours on their airframes, but plenty of life left for the purposes he had in mind. He established a maintenance facility where mechanics stripped out passenger seats and modified cargo holds to accommodate the enormous cocaine shipments. He hired pilots from the Mexican Air Force, men with thousands of hours of flight time, men who knew how to navigate by instruments, how to fly low to avoid radar, how to land on improvised runways carved from dirt and reinforced with nothing more than gravel and hope. The logistics network he constructed was extraordinary in its sophistication. In Colombia, he forged partnerships with the Cali cartel and later with the Norte del Valle cartel, negotiating deals that gave him cocaine on consignment. He would pay after delivery, and increasingly, he would pay not in cash, but would simply take a percentage of each load as his transportation fee. This arrangement transformed his business model. Instead of earning a few $1,000s per kilogram to move someone else's product, he now owned a portion of the product itself, which he could sell to distributors in the United States for 10 or 20 times what it cost in Colombia. His profit margins exploded. His wealth accumulated at a pace that shocked even the cynical veterans of the drug trade. From Colombian airports and clandestine runways hidden in the jungle, his planes would lift into the sky, their bellies packed with cocaine wrapped in layers of plastic and tape. The pilots would fly north, crossing Central America and the Gulf of Mexico, navigating by GPS and radio contact with ground coordinators who monitored law enforcement frequencies. In northern Mexico, in the states of Chihuahua, Sonora, and Coahuila, Amado had prepared landing zones, abandoned airstrips, straight stretches of highway, even sections of desert that had been leveled and packed hard enough to support the weight of a commercial jet. Ground crews waited at these locations, armed men who provided security and workers who could unload 7 tons of cocaine in under an hour, transferring the bricks into trucks that would then disperse to stash houses throughout northern Mexico before the final push across the border into the United States. The scale was unprecedented. A single flight could carry more cocaine than most trafficking organizations moved in a year. Amado was running multiple flights per week at the height of his operation. Conservative estimates suggest that the Juarez cartel moved more than 200 tons of cocaine into the United States between 1993 and 1997. At an average wholesale price of $15,000 to $20,000 per kilogram, the revenue was staggering. Even after paying the Colombians, after paying pilots and ground crews, after paying bribes to Mexican military officers and government officials, after paying for the aircraft and the fuel and the endless operational expenses, Amado Carrillo Fuentes was accumulating wealth at a rate that put him among the richest criminals in human history. Forbes magazine would later estimate his net worth at $25 billion, placing him among the wealthiest individuals on Earth during the mid-1990s. $25 billion. A fortune built on powder and pain, on the addictions of millions and the violence required to maintain control of the pipeline that fed those addictions. $25 billion, and nowhere safe to spend it. Because wealth of this magnitude attracts attention, and attention brings enemies. Enemies in rival cartels, enemies in law enforcement agencies across multiple nations, enemies within his own organization who believed they could take what he had built if they could only eliminate the man at the top. And so Amado Carrillo built fortresses. He purchased properties throughout Mexico, safe houses and ranches where he could hide when the pressure intensified. But his primary residence, the place he considered home when he allowed himself the luxury of such sentiments, was a mansion in Jardines del Pedregal, one of Mexico City's most exclusive and prestigious neighborhoods. Jardines del Pedregal sits in the southern section of Mexico City, built upon the lava fields left by the eruption of the Zitl volcano nearly 2,000 years ago. The volcanic rock created dramatic landscapes, jagged formations, natural caves, terrain that was nearly impossible to develop until the 1940s, when architect Luis Barragan conceived of a luxury residential zone that would work with the landscape rather than against it. He designed winding roads that followed the contours of the lava flows, integrated the rock formations into garden designs, and created an aesthetic that combined modernist architecture with organic natural elements. The result was a neighborhood unlike any other in Mexico City, a zone of artistic homes, dramatic landscapes, and extreme privacy. By the 1990s, Jardines del Pedregal had become home to Mexico's elite: politicians, industrialists, artists, and yes, drug traffickers who had accumulated enough wealth to purchase properties worth millions. The neighborhood's privacy was its greatest asset. High walls surrounded every property. Security was tight. Neighbors maintained discreet distance from each other, asking no questions about the sources of wealth that funded the mansions hidden behind gates and walls. Amado Carrillo's mansion occupied a substantial lot in this landscape of controlled opulence. The property was valued at $4.5 million, though its true worth was incalculable when measured against what it represented: safety, status, a headquarters from which he could coordinate an empire that stretched from Colombia to Chicago. The mansion contained 9 bedrooms, though Amado rarely hosted guests who stayed overnight. Several of the bedrooms featured indoor hot tubs, private retreats within the larger retreat, spaces designed for relaxation that Amado seldom had time to enjoy. The bathrooms were appointed with imported fixtures, marble countertops, gold faucets that spoke to wealth accumulated faster than taste could be refined. The garage could accommodate 20 vehicles. 20. A parking structure attached to a private residence, capable of housing a fleet that included armored SUVs, luxury sedans, sports cars purchased on impulse and driven once before being forgotten. The vehicles rotated constantly. Amado's security protocols demanded unpredictability. He never used the same car 2 days in a row. He never followed the same route twice. He trusted no one completely and everyone conditionally, parceling out information so that no single person in his organization knew enough to betray the entire operation. Inside the mansion, an indoor pool provided recreation without the vulnerability of outdoor exposure. The water was heated year-round, maintained by a staff who worked in silence and asked no questions. Adjacent to the pool area, a room that real estate documents euphemistically described as a playhouse for girls, a space whose true purpose remains unclear and perhaps is better left unexplored. Though it hints at the casual moral vacuity that often accompanies vast criminal wealth, the sense that anything can be purchased, any desire fulfilled, any boundary crossed without consequence. The home theater featured a screen that dominated an entire wall, stadium seating for a dozen people, a projection system that cost more than most Mexican families earned in a decade. Amado would watch movies here in the rare hours when he allowed himself leisure, though associates later claimed he had difficulty sitting still, that even during films, his mind would race ahead to the next shipment, the next threat, the next move in an endless chess game played for stakes measured in tons and billions. But the most significant feature of the mansion was invisible to casual observation: bulletproof windows. Every window in the structure had been replaced with laminated glass capable of stopping rounds from high-powered rifles. The modification cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and took months to complete, requiring specialized installation to ensure the reinforced windows fit perfectly into frames that weren't designed to support their weight. The bulletproof glass transformed the mansion from a residence into a fortress, a place where Amado could sleep, on those rare occasions when sleep came, without fearing that assassins might cut him down with sniper fire from the volcanic rocks surrounding the property. The fortress was necessary because by the mid-1990s, Amado Carrillo Fuentes had become one of the most wanted men in the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration had made him a priority target, dedicating enormous resources to tracking his movements, mapping his organization, and building cases against his lieutenants in hopes of flipping them to testify against the boss. The Mexican government faced intense pressure from Washington to act against the major cartels, pressure that occasionally resulted in military operations and arrests, though more often resulted in carefully choreographed performances designed to appear as if action were being taken while the fundamental machinery of the drug trade continued humming beneath the surface. Other cartels viewed Amado as a threat and an opportunity. A threat because his success was claiming market share that might otherwise be theirs, because his pilots and planes gave him advantages they couldn't match, because his wealth allowed him to outbid them for crucial plaza bosses and corrupt officials. An opportunity because eliminating Amado would create a power vacuum, and power vacuums meant territory and routes up for grabs, meant the possibility of absorbing pieces of the Juarez cartel's infrastructure into their own organizations. Even within his own organization, Amado faced threats. The Juarez cartel employed hundreds of people directly and thousands indirectly: pilots, drivers, accountants, enforcers, scouts, money launderers, lawyers, chemists, and on, a vast criminal corporation with all the internal politics and betrayals that plague any large organization, legitimate or otherwise. Lieutenants grew ambitious. Trusted advisors accepted bribes from rivals. Sicarios, assassins, who today killed at Amado's command, might tomorrow be contracted to kill Amado himself if the price was right and the odds seemed favorable. The paranoia was not irrational. The paranoia was survival instinct, the recognition that in his world, only the perpetually vigilant lived long enough to enjoy their wealth. And so Amado moved constantly, sleeping in different houses, traveling in convoy with armed guards, using encrypted communications, layers of intermediaries, a security apparatus that cost millions annually but was worth every peso because the alternative to security was death. Yet despite all precautions, despite the bulletproof glass and the armed guards and the constantly changing routines, Amado Carrillo faced a threat he could not shoot, could not bribe, could not outrun: his own fame. By 1997, his face was too recognizable. Too many law enforcement agents had memorized his features. Too many rival traffickers knew what he looked like and had distributed his photo to their assassination teams. Too many journalists had published his image. His face had become a liability, a target he carried with him wherever he went. And so he made a decision that would prove fatal. He would change his face. He would undergo extensive plastic surgery, not minor modifications, but a complete reconstruction that would render him unrecognizable. He would alter his cheekbones, his nose, his jawline, his eyes. He would emerge from surgery as a different person physically, allowing him to move more freely, to reclaim some measure of the anonymity he had lost as his empire grew. From the mansion in Jardines del Pedregal, Amado coordinated the details. He researched surgeons, not just in Mexico but internationally, seeking the most skilled practitioners willing to perform such extensive work and willing to maintain absolute discretion about their famous patient. He settled on a team of Mexican surgeons who came with impressive credentials and references from others in the criminal underworld who had successfully altered their appearances to evade capture. The surgery was scheduled for July 4, 1997, at Santa Monica Hospital in Mexico City, a private medical facility accustomed to treating wealthy patients who valued privacy above all else. Amado made arrangements for security, bribing hospital staff to ensure no one would ask questions, positioning his own men throughout the facility to watch for any signs of betrayal or police activity. He said his goodbyes to his inner circle, though he framed the surgery as routine rather than the radical reconstruction it was, maintaining operational security even with his most trusted associates. On the morning of July 4th, he arrived at the hospital. He submitted to the pre-operative procedures, the blood work, the consent forms, the final consultations with the surgical team about exactly how his new face would be structured. And then he lay down on the operating table, allowed the anesthesiologist to insert the IV line, felt the cool rush of sedatives entering his bloodstream, and surrendered consciousness, trusting that he would wake transformed, reborn, ready to lead his empire for another decade or more under a new identity. The surgery began. The hours stretched out. The surgeons worked, cutting and reshaping, reconstructing the architecture of his face. 8 hours passed, and then, sometime during that 8th hour, something went wrong. The official reports would later cite complications from the anesthesia and failure of his cardiovascular system. His heart, which had beaten reliably for 40 years through stress and violence, and the chemical toll of a lifestyle that aged men faster than natural time, stopped beating on that operating table. The surgeons attempted resuscitation. They injected medications, applied defibrillation, performed cardiac massage. But Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the Lord of the Skies, the man who had commanded a $25 billion empire, the man who had revolutionized the cocaine trade, did not respond. At 40 years old in a hospital bed in Mexico City, he died. His face was half reconstructed, his features somewhere between who he had been and who he would never become. The transformation was incomplete. The plan had failed. Or had it? Because almost immediately, conspiracy theories began circulating. Some claimed Amado had not died, but had faked his death, that the body in the morgue was a double, that the entire surgery and death had been staged to allow him to escape the pressure from law enforcement and rivals, to disappear into a new life under a completely new identity. Others suggested assassination, claiming that rivals had bribed the surgeons or the anesthesiologist to administer a lethal dose, making his death appear accidental while actually carrying out a hit that couldn't be accomplished on the street where his security was too tight. Still, others pointed fingers at the Mexican government itself, suggesting that officials had decided Amado was too powerful, too destabilizing, and had arranged his death to appease American pressure and to prevent the Juarez cartel from becoming more powerful than the state. The conspiracy theories gained traction when, in the weeks following Amado's death, his surgeons began disappearing. Their bodies were discovered inside oil drums, bearing signs of extensive torture. Someone had wanted to know what happened in that operating room, or someone had wanted to ensure that the surgeons could never reveal what they knew about Amado's death. The murders of the medical team suggested that the official explanation of accidental death during surgery was incomplete at best and fabricated at worst. But whether Amado died accidentally, was assassinated, or somehow faked his death and vanished into a carefully constructed new identity, the result was the same. The Lord of the Skies was gone, his empire leaderless, his vast wealth scattered across dozens of properties, bank accounts, and shell corporations that would take years for authorities to unravel. The mansion in Jardines del Pedregal stood empty, its bulletproof windows reflecting the sun, its 20-car garage gradually emptying as vehicles were seized or stolen or driven away by lieutenants claiming pieces of what Amado had left behind. The indoor pool's water grew stagnant. The home theater's projection system gathered dust. The 9 bedrooms with their indoor hot tubs waited for occupants who would never arrive. If what you've heard so far has pulled you into this story, do something for me. Leave a single word in the comments. Empire. Just that word. Let's see how many of you are still here, still listening, still following the Lord of the Skies down into the shadows. The Mexican government seized the property within months of Amado's death, declaring it an asset obtained through illicit means, subject to forfeiture, under laws designed to strip drug traffickers of their ill-gotten wealth. For years, the mansion sat in legal limbo, maintained minimally by government workers who mowed the lawns and prevented vandalism, but otherwise left the structure to sink slowly into disrepair. The bulletproof windows developed a film of grime. The volcanic rock gardens that Luis Barragan had envisioned as harmonious integrations of nature and architecture became overgrown with weeds that found purchase in the porous volcanic soil. The mansion, which had once hummed with the energy of a criminal empire's command center, fell silent except for the occasional visit from bureaucrats cataloging assets or journalists seeking the story behind the walls. The death of Amado Carrillo Fuentes did not end the Juarez cartel. Criminal organizations do not dissolve simply because their leaders die. They fracture, reconstitute, continue under new leadership, and often become more violent in the power struggles that follow succession crises. Amado's brother, Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, known as El Viceroy, claimed leadership of the organization, attempting to hold together the networks and relationships that Amado had constructed. But without Amado's vision and logistical genius, the Juarez cartel began losing ground to rival organizations, particularly the Sinaloa cartel led by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, who saw opportunity in the power vacuum and launched a war for control of the Ciudad Juarez Plaza. The violence that followed was apocalyptic. Ciudad Juarez, which had been violent under Amado's reign but functionally controlled, descended into chaos. Thousands died as the Sinaloa cartel and the Juarez cartel battled for supremacy. Sicarios killing sicarios, police officers executing suspected cartel members, innocent civilians caught in crossfire or mistakenly targeted, journalists murdered for reporting on the violence. Entire neighborhoods terrorized by armed convoys that roamed the streets, settling scores and asserting dominance. By the late 2000s, Ciudad Juarez had become one of the most dangerous cities on earth, a place where morgues overflowed with bodies and parents forbade their children from going outside after dark. The war over the Juarez Plaza demonstrated the terrible irony at the heart of Amado's empire. He had built a system so valuable that men would kill by the thousands for control of it, a pipeline so profitable that it would be watered with blood for decades after his death. His genius for logistics had created a route that moved cocaine with unprecedented efficiency, and that efficiency made the route worth fighting for long after the man who created it was gone. Back in Mexico City, in the quiet exclusivity of Jardines del Pedregal, the mansion waited. The neighbors, accustomed to discretion, said nothing publicly about the drug lord who had lived among them, though privately many must have wondered how close they had come to danger, how many times they had driven past Amado's convoy without knowing who sat behind those tinted windows, how many tons of cocaine had been discussed and coordinated within a house visible from their own bedroom windows. The years passed. The mansion remained in government custody, too controversial to sell openly, too valuable to simply demolish. It existed in a bureaucratic purgatory, a physical reminder of Mexico's complicated relationship with the drug trade, an industry that had corrupted institutions, financed political campaigns, employed millions directly and indirectly, generated violence that had claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, and yet remained so deeply embedded in the economy and social fabric that rooting it out seemed impossible, like trying to remove a tumor wrapped around vital organs. Then, in 2020, the Mexican government announced an unusual decision. They would auction the mansion. The proceeds would go to public health initiatives, transforming blood money into medicine, corruption into cure. The symbolism was powerful, though many noted the irony that the healthcare system receiving funding from the sale of Amado's mansion was the same healthcare system that had failed to prevent his death, or had perhaps facilitated it, on that operating table 23 years earlier. The auction attracted international attention. Real estate speculators analyzed the property. Journalists wrote features about the drug lord's palace going on the market, but when the bidding closed, the property sold for only $2 million, less than half its estimated value at the time of Amado's death, and a fraction of what comparable properties in Jardines del Pedregal typically commanded. The low price suggested either a lack of interested buyers, given the property's dark history, or perhaps a private arrangement that benefited someone willing to navigate the complicated optics of purchasing a dead drug lord's home. The buyer remained anonymous, shielded by layers of corporate entities and legal representatives. They took possession of the 9-bedroom mansion, the 20-car garage, the indoor pool, the home theater, the bulletproof windows that had failed to protect their original owner from the enemy that ultimately killed him. What they planned to do with the property remained unclear. Renovate and resell? Demolish and rebuild? Move in and live surrounded by the ghosts of empire? But the Mexican government was not finished with Amado's mansion. In a move that seemed designed more for publicity than practical revenue generation, officials announced in 2022 that a second property connected to Amado, some reports suggested it was the same Jardines del Pedregal mansion, while others indicated it was a different residence in the network of safe houses he had maintained, would be raffled off to the public. Raffle tickets would cost just $10 each. Anyone could enter. Anyone could win. A drug lord's palace, obtained for the price of a meal at a casual restaurant, yours if the lottery gods smiled upon you. The raffle captured imaginations worldwide. Here was the ultimate inversion of Amado's story. A man who had accumulated billions through violence and corruption, whose mansion had been purchased with money stained by addiction and death, whose empire had required constant vigilance and paranoia to maintain, and now any random citizen could potentially win that mansion for $10, no violence required, no risk beyond the negligible cost of a lottery ticket. The universe's sense of irony seemed finely tuned. Approximately 250,000 people purchased raffle tickets. The government collected $2.5 million, which again was earmarked for public health initiatives. The drawing was held with appropriate ceremony, broadcast live to ensure transparency and prevent accusations of corruption. Though cynics noted that in a country where drug cartels had infiltrated institutions at every level, the idea that a raffle couldn't be rigged seemed charmingly naive. The winner was Maria Elena Quiñones, a woman from central Mexico who worked in a small shop and had purchased a single ticket on impulse while running errands. She wept when officials called to inform her of her winnings. She told reporters she had never imagined owning a home, much less a mansion, in one of Mexico City's most exclusive neighborhoods. She described plans to move her family into the property, to finally have space for her children and grandchildren, to live in comfort she had never dared dream possible. But the fairy tale ending proved complicated. Maria Elena soon discovered that owning a mansion is different from affording to maintain a mansion. The property taxes on a home valued in the millions were far beyond her ability to pay. The utility costs, heating that indoor pool, powering that home theater, simply keeping the lights on in a structure with 9 bedrooms and countless other rooms, were staggering. The maintenance requirements of an aging luxury property, especially one with custom features like bulletproof windows that couldn't simply be replaced with standard glass from a hardware store, demanded constant investment. Within months, Maria Elena put the mansion up for sale. She could not afford to keep it. The dream that had seemed like a miracle quickly revealed itself as a beautiful burden, too expensive to bear. The mansion that Amado Carrillo had purchased for $4.5 million, that had served as headquarters for a $25 billion empire, that had cost the lives of thousands of people whose deaths could be traced back to the cocaine that moved through the logistics networks coordinated from behind those bulletproof windows, ended up listed on real estate websites for anyone with sufficient funds and insufficient concern about the property's history to make an offer. The story of the mansion mirrors the story of the man who built it. Initial promise giving way to complication. Success breeding vulnerability. The things acquired at terrible cost proving impossible to hold. Amado Carrillo had wanted security and found paranoia. He had accumulated billions and died trying to change his face. He had revolutionized the cocaine trade, and in doing so created a prize so valuable that the fight for it continues still, decades after his death, bodies still dropping in Ciudad Juarez and throughout Mexico as cartels war for control of routes and plazas. But to understand the full tragedy of Amado's story, we must return to the fundamental question. What drove him? What compels a boy from Guamuchilito to enter a trade where the likely outcomes are prison or death? Where even success brings no peace? Where billions of dollars cannot purchase safety or rest? The answer is complex, woven from threads of poverty and ambition, from the lack of legitimate opportunities in regions where government has failed for generations, from the seductive appeal of respect and power in societies where these things are otherwise reserved for the few born into privilege. Amado grew up watching his father work himself to exhaustion for wages that barely fed the family. He watched his mother stretch insufficient resources across too many children, performing the mathematics of scarcity that billions of people worldwide know intimately. Who eats? Who goes without? Which needs get met, and which must be deferred until resources improve. And resources never improve for the structurally impoverished. They remain fixed in place, generation after generation, while others accumulate wealth through inheritance and connections and accidents of birth that distribute opportunity as unevenly as rainfall in a desert. The drug trade offered an exit from that trap. It offered the possibility of wealth for those willing to accept the risks, and when you start with nothing, when you face a future of grinding poverty regardless of how hard you work at legitimate labor, the risks seem acceptable. Death or prison? Perhaps. But also perhaps a mansion. Respect. The ability to provide for your family in ways that generations before could never imagine. The calculation was rational given the circumstances, even if the ultimate outcomes were tragic. This is not to excuse Amado's choices or to romanticize the drug trade. The cocaine that moved through his logistics networks destroyed lives. Not just the American addicts whose demand drove the trade, but their families, their communities, the Mexican farmers forced to grow drug crops or face violence. The young men recruited as sicarios and thrown into wars they didn't start. The government officials who might have served their country but instead accepted bribes that corroded institutions from within. The body count attributable to Amado's empire, directly and indirectly, easily reaches into the thousands, perhaps tens of thousands when you include all the violence that flowed from the distribution networks and street-level sales of the cocaine he moved. But Amado himself was also a product of systems larger than any individual. The American drug policy that created black markets by criminalizing substances instead of treating addiction as a public health issue. The Mexican governmental corruption that dated back generations, creating an environment where the law was negotiable and enforcement selective. The global economic structures that concentrated wealth in the hands of a few while condemning billions to poverty, creating the desperation that makes the drug trade's risks seem acceptable. The cultural narratives around masculinity and success that equated wealth with worth and celebrated outlaws who beat the system, however temporarily. None of this absolves Amado of responsibility for his choices. He chose to enter the drug trade. He chose to assassinate his boss. He chose to expand his operations even as the body count rose. He chose to live behind bulletproof glass rather than walk away from an empire that required constant vigilance to maintain. At every juncture, he could have made different choices. Though we should be honest about how constrained those choices were by circumstances beyond his control, and about how the same structures that enabled his rise ensured that if he didn't fill the role of major trafficker, someone else would have, because the demand existed, and demand always finds supply in markets both legal and illegal. The mansion in Jardines del Pedregal stands today as a monument to these complicated truths. It is a beautiful property in an exclusive neighborhood, architecturally interesting, well-appointed, desirable in many respects. It is also a crime scene in slow motion, a place where strategies were discussed that led to thousands of deaths, where blood money was counted, where a man who had accumulated more wealth than he could spend plotted to change his face because his success had made him a target. Future occupants of the mansion, assuming someone eventually purchases it and moves in, will sleep in bedrooms where Amado once slept, will swim in the indoor pool where he sought relaxation between coordinating cocaine flights, will look through bulletproof windows that he installed to protect himself from the countless enemies his success had created. They will occupy a space that is haunted not by supernatural forces, but by history, by the accumulated weight of choices made and consequences suffered, by the fundamental truth that wealth extracted through violence and suffering carries a cost that cannot be calculated in dollars or pesos. Some might argue that the mansion should have been demolished rather than sold or raffled, that certain places are too corrupted by their history to be rehabilitated, that the proper response is erasure rather than transformation. But Mexico has too many such places, too many properties and institutions and entire regions that are entangled with the drug trade. To demolish them all would be to demolish significant portions of the country itself. The Mexican people have instead chosen a different path, acknowledging the dark history while attempting to repurpose what remains, transforming former assets of drug cartels into schools and hospitals, selling properties and directing proceeds toward public goods, trying to extract something positive from the wreckage. Whether this approach succeeds remains an open question. The auction and raffle of Amado's mansion generated a few $1,000,000 for public health initiatives, a trivial sum compared to the billions that flowed through his organization. A rounding error against the social costs of the violence and corruption his empire generated. The symbolism of converting a drug lord's palace into public benefit is powerful, but symbolism does not fund healthcare systems or rebuild communities shattered by violence or provide economic opportunities that might prevent future generations from seeing the drug trade as their best option. The war for control of the Juarez Plaza continues. The cocaine still flows northward, though now it moves through networks operated by different organizations using different methods. The Juarez cartel, which dominated under Amado's leadership, has been weakened but not eliminated. Other cartels have risen to prominence, adapting to law enforcement tactics, finding new routes, employing new technologies. Because the fundamental economics of the drug trade have not changed. Huge demand in the United States, abundant supply in South America, and enormous profits for anyone who can move product from source to market. The Boeing 727s that Amado used to revolutionize cocaine transportation are mostly grounded now, too large and too conspicuous for modern trafficking operations that have adapted to increased aerial surveillance and interdiction. Traffickers have returned to using smaller aircraft that can land on improvised runways, have shifted more product to maritime routes using submarines and fast boats, have increasingly moved cocaine through legitimate shipping containers where it is hidden among legal cargo, and have begun experimenting with drones capable of carrying loads across the border without risking human pilots. But Amado's fundamental insight, that controlling transportation is the key to controlling the drug trade, remains valid. The organizations that dominate today are those that have solved the logistics problem, that have built sophisticated networks capable of moving multi-ton shipments from production zones to retail markets while evading interdiction by law enforcement agencies across multiple nations. The methods have evolved, but the principles remain the same, and those principles bear Amado's fingerprints. His legacy is thus twofold. On one hand, he demonstrated that Mexican traffickers could be not just subcontractors, but major players in the international cocaine trade, could build empires that rivaled and sometimes exceeded those of the Colombian cartels that had previously dominated. He showed that innovation and logistics could generate wealth on a scale that most criminals never imagined, that thinking like a businessman rather than a street thug could transform a small-time operation into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. Every major Mexican cartel leader who came after Amado learned from his example, studied his methods, tried to replicate his success. On the other hand, his legacy is measured in violence and suffering. The war for the Juarez Plaza that followed his death killed thousands. The cocaine that moved through his logistics networks fed addictions that destroyed families and communities. The corruption that he funded and depended upon corroded Mexican institutions in ways that continue to undermine governance and public trust. The example he set inspired thousands of young men to enter the drug trade, seeking to become the next Lord of the Skies, and most of them ended up dead or imprisoned, their ambitions ground to nothing in the machinery of an industry that consumes its participants as readily as it consumes its products. In the final analysis, Amado Carrillo Fuentes was a man of extraordinary intelligence and ambition who applied his talents to an endeavor that brought wealth without peace, power without security, and success without meaning. He accumulated $25 billion and died on an operating table trying to change his face. He built an empire that required constant violence to maintain and fell apart within years of his death. He purchased a mansion with bulletproof windows and ended up unable to escape the thing that finally killed him: his own fame, the recognition that came with success, the terrible irony that achieving his goals made those goals impossible to enjoy. The mansion stands in Jardines del Pedregal, waiting for its next chapter, its bulletproof windows still reflecting the sun, its 9 bedrooms still empty, its 20-car garage still capable of housing a fleet, but housing nothing now except shadows and memory. Perhaps someone will eventually purchase it and transform it into something new. Will fill those rooms with laughter and light. Will make peace with the history that soaks into its foundations. Perhaps it will stand empty for years more, too expensive for most people to purchase, too controversial for those who can afford it to want the association. Or perhaps, in a way, the mansion has already fulfilled its final purpose, serving as a monument to the fundamental truth that drove Amado's rise and sealed his doom. In a world of vast inequality, where billions of dollars accumulate in the hands of the few while billions of people scramble for scraps, where legitimate paths to wealth and respect are closed to most, by accidents of birth and geography, the drug trade will continue offering an alternative, however dark and deadly. Young men will continue making the calculation that Amado made in the mountains of Sinaloa decades ago, weighing the risks against the potential rewards, choosing to step into the shadows in pursuit of wealth and respect that seem impossible to achieve through legitimate means. And some of them will succeed for a time. They will build empires and purchase mansions. They will move tons of cocaine and accumulate billions of dollars. They will install bulletproof glass and hire armies of bodyguards. They will live like kings in fortresses, surrounded by luxury and violence in equal measure. And then, almost inevitably, they will fall, killed by rivals, captured by law enforcement, betrayed by associates, or in Amado's case, dying on an operating table in a desperate attempt to escape the fame that success had brought. The cycle will continue because the structural conditions that enable it continue. The American appetite for cocaine has not diminished despite decades of drug war. The poverty that drives young men into the drug trade has not been meaningfully addressed by governments in Mexico or throughout Latin America. The corruption that allows cartels to operate has not been rooted out of Mexican institutions. The profits that make the drug trade attractive have not been reduced by interdiction or enforcement. And so the mansions will keep being built, the empires will keep rising and falling, the violence will continue claiming lives by the thousands, and the Lord of the Skies will be remembered not as an aberration, but as an archetype, a template that countless others will attempt to follow, most of them failing, a few succeeding temporarily before meeting the same fate that Amado met. Death or prison, their mansions auctioned or seized, their empires fragmenting, their legacies measured in body counts and cautionary tales. Amado Carrillo Fuentes lived 40 years. For 4 of those years, from 1993 until 1997, he commanded one of the most powerful criminal organizations on earth, moved billions of dollars worth of cocaine, accumulated personal wealth that made him one of the richest men alive, and fundamentally changed how the international drug trade operated. And then he died, his face half reconstructed on an operating table, his empire already beginning to fracture before his heart stopped beating, his mansion in Jardines del Pedregal standing empty and waiting for the bureaucratic machinery of the Mexican government to decide what to do with the palace that the Lord of the Skies left behind. The bulletproof windows did not save him. The $25 billion did not save him. The fleet of jets and the army of sicarios and the network of corrupt officials did not save him. In the end, nothing saved him. Because in the world he inhabited, there is no saving, only postponing, only surviving one more day until the day you do not survive, until the thing you cannot outrun or outfight or outbribe finally catches up and brings the empire crashing down. The mansion in Jardines del Pedregal, whenever you happen to pass by, stands as a reminder of this truth. Behind its walls and bulletproof glass, a man once coordinated an empire worth billions. From its rooms he sent planes into the sky carrying tons of cocaine. In its bedrooms, he tried to sleep despite the paranoia that must have whispered constantly that tonight might be the night that rivals or law enforcement finally located him, that his security protocols might fail, that the walls he had built around himself might prove insufficient against the countless enemies his success had created. And then, one day he left, traveling to a hospital for surgery that was supposed to give him a new face and a new future, and he never returned. The mansion waited, as it waits still, empty and expensive, and haunted by a history that cannot be erased no matter who eventually moves in, no matter how many coats of paint are applied to the walls, no matter how thoroughly the new occupants try to forget that they are living in a palace built by the Lord of the Skies, whose empire has fallen to earth, but whose story remains, a warning and a legend, a testament to ambition without wisdom and success without peace. Before you go, I want to know something. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story, someone fascinated by true crime, by history, by the dark side of ambition. Copy the link and send it. Let this story reach further. Let it be told again and again until its lessons are finally learned. Amado Carrillo Fuentes is gone now. The empire is gone. The fleet of 727s is grounded. The cocaine pipeline has been rerouted through other hands. But the mansion remains in Jardines del Pedregal, standing on volcanic rock, looking out through bulletproof glass at a world that has moved on from the Lord of the Skies while simultaneously continuing the exact patterns that enabled his rise and ensured his fall. And perhaps that is the final, cruelest irony, that Amado's story is not unique, not even particularly unusual in the context of Mexico's drug trade. He was simply more successful than most, his empire larger, his wealth greater, his methods more innovative. But the arc of his life, poor boy enters drug trade seeking escape from poverty, rises through violence and intelligence, accumulates vast wealth that brings no peace, dies young after a brief reign, is a template that has been followed thousands of times, that is being followed right now by young men in Sinaloa and Michoacán and Tamaulipas who look at Amado's story and see not a warning but an inspiration, proof that a boy from nowhere can become a legend, even if the legend ends on an operating table with his face half finished and his empire already crumbling. The mansion stands. The story continues. The lessons remain unlearned. And somewhere in Mexico tonight, a young man is making the same calculation that Amado made decades ago, weighing the risks against the potential rewards, deciding that the chance to escape poverty and build an empire is worth the near certainty of death or imprisonment, worth the paranoia and the violence, and the bulletproof glass that cannot ultimately protect against the countless threats that success generates in the drug trade. He will be wrong, as Amado was wrong, as nearly all of them are wrong. But he will not believe he is wrong until it is too late, until he is dying in a hail of gunfire, or being led away in handcuffs, or perhaps, like Amado, lying on an operating table as his heart stops beating and his incomplete transformation from one identity to another is abandoned, leaving him suspended forever between who he was and who he tried to become. The mansion in Jardines del Pedregal waits for its next owner, its story far from over, its role in the endless cycle of Mexican drug trade history continuing whether anyone lives behind its walls or not, because the story was never really about the mansion anyway. It was always about what the mansion represented, the illusion that wealth built on cocaine and violence can provide safety and peace, the fantasy that bulletproof glass can protect against every threat, the lie that empire can be permanent. When history shows again and again that empires fall, especially those built on foundations as unstable as the drug trade, where allies become enemies and success becomes vulnerability, and the Lord of the Skies eventually falls back to earth, his wings clipped by fame, by paranoia, by the surgical complications that may or may not have been complications at all. This is the entire story of Amado Carrillo's Mexico mansion. This is the story of the Lord of the Skies and his $25 billion empire. This is the story of bulletproof glass and Boeing 727s, of 9 bedrooms and 20-car garages, of indoor pools and home theaters that could not provide the escape their owner desperately needed. This is the story of a fortress that could not protect the man inside, of wealth that could not purchase safety, of success that brought only paranoia and violence, and, ultimately, death on an operating table in a hospital in Mexico City on the morning of July 4, 1997. The mansion stands. The empire has fallen. The Lord of the Skies has returned to Earth. And the story, like the drug trade itself, continues without pause, without mercy, without end.